we need to make sure we have all our files ready. If you remember well, we had created the load balancer controller helm values.yaml file right here and populated it with this. So the next one will be to create a subfolder for our sample apps. So I'll call it examples folder, and in the examples folder we'll create 3 files. We'll start with the default.yaml file. Next one will be the bloom demo YAML, and then lastly it will be a game.yaml. With these 3 files, we'll start with the first one. The content of these files will also be shared with you, or to make things easier, the whole repository will be shared with you, and then you can reference and substitute in your values where necessary. Rename this file to default backend, which we'll use to create our default backend. This one you can rename it to bloom-demo, and this one you can rename it to game2048. Close other files and leave the default.backend open. So we'll start populating our Kubernetes manifest one by one. For the default backend, it will be installed in the default namespace, and the default namespace is usually created within the cluster, so there is no need of creating the namespace resource. We'll proceed and start with the deployment resource right here. So this deployment resource will be using the name of default backend. It will be installed in the default namespace, which is created by default in our Kubernetes cluster. Then it will have the match labels of name and also the profile. So this is a label that I added that will be used to select the specific Fargate profile that this deployment pods will be deployed to. You can use any labels here as long as you make sure that they match these labels that we passed under these selectors here. So make sure at least one of these labels under match labels and also under metadata.labels match one of these label criteria specified here. For our case, we are using apps-default, which matches apps-star. And also we have now the one that matches this namespace, the default namespace. It's right here. You can see we have a selector that has that namespace and also has the label that we are using. So this wildcard label matches this label. For the default backend, you can use any Docker image as long as you make sure your cluster has access to that image or it can download it. For this case, I built this default backend and I pushed it to the Docker Hub under my account. After the deployment, we need to create a service for our deployment. The service will be channeling traffic to our pods, and the service uses the same name as the deployment, and then we specify the service port, which is 80, and then the target port is the port on which the container listens, and the port that is exposed by this Docker container. Then protocol will be TCP. Then the type of our service, we can use node port. Then the selector will be the same as the ones we used for the deployment. Lastly, we need to create our ingress resource. And for this resource, it will have multiple configurations. We'll start with the first one. So then under annotations, I'll add them one by one while explaining. We need the load balancer that will be created to be internet facing. So this means that it will be created in a public subnet that is linked to our cluster. Then the target type for our ingress resource will be a target type of IP. This annotation should specify IP because we are using Fargate. Next, we need to specify an ingress group name. This will ensure that all resources that use this group name will share a load balancer. Then since this is the default backend, we need to specify the group order. So this specifies the priority for this ingress resource in case there is another resource that uses the same host name as it does. For this case, we are giving it the highest possible value so that it has the lowest possible priority. This will ensure that if there is a resource that uses its host name, that resource will be loaded first before the default backend can be loaded. Here, we'll leave this as blank because we are supposed to add an ACM certificate ARN. Then we'll specify the redirection ports. We are listening on HTTP and also on HTTPS port 443. So this one specifies the listening ports that I will be using. And then the last annotation, the SSL redirect, specifies how the redirection will work. You can see type of the SSL redirect is redirect, and then the configuration for the redirect, it will be redirecting to HTTPS on port 443, and the status code will be HTTP 301, which is a permanent redirect. Remember to come back and supply the certificate ARN after we've created it. This one will be done after we've created all the resources. Once you add the annotations, make sure you indent them correctly and at the same level so that you create a valid YAML. Then we'll add the remaining part, which is the spec body. Here we'll use the ingress class name LB. In the LB controller right here, we specify that the controller should create the ingress class resource. By default, the ingress class resource created uses this name LB. Then we have this domain. This is our domain, and we've created a subdomain on Route 53 as a hosted zone. So this is the subdomain that we'll be using for this tutorial. And on our AWS account, our user has access to Route 53. So this user can modify records on this subdomain. For the default backend, we are using a wildcard so that it can capture all the possible combination of subdomain prefixes and redirect that traffic to the default backend service. So if you visit this subdomain and enter a host name here that doesn't exist, then the default backend will be automatically loaded. We'll test that towards the end. Then we haven't forgotten, there is one annotation that we can add, which is the Kubernetes IO ingress class. We cannot have the annotation and the class name at the same time. So the annotation can be used if we comment out the class name, or we can decide to use the class name and then comment out the annotation. That's why I skipped it, because we are specifying the class name down here. So choose one of these. You can't use both of them. That's our default backend. Then let's configure our Bloom demo. The Bloom demo will go in its own namespace named apps, and for the deployment, it will be configured like this. This is also an Next.js sample application that I like using for Kubernetes deployment. You can see we are using the same strategy for selector labels. So we have the resource name here, which is Bloom Lessons, and then now we have the selector, which has the name, and then it has our label profile. I'm using profile because these labels will be used to match Fargate profile. So personally, I think using profile makes more sense, but you can use any labels you want here as long as you make sure they match the selectors you used for your Fargate profiles right here. At least one of these Fargate profiles selectors. You can see for this Bloom demo, we are using the profile apps, and here we have the namespace apps that matches the namespace and also the profile that matches this. Let's go next. Let's create a service for our demo session. For the service part, we'll be sharing the same name across all resources in this demo file. So it will share the same name as the deployment, and then it will be exposing port 80. It will send traffic to the container on port 3000, which is the container port that is exposed in this Docker image. Then the protocol will be TCP, and we'll be using Node port, and then we'll be using the same selectors that are used on the deployment so that the service can correctly select these pods. Then we can add the ingress configuration and just separate the two resources. Then under the annotations, we can begin with this annotation right here, which we can comment out because we won't be using it. Then the second annotation will be the following. So here we are using the group order of 1, which is the lowest group order, which means this ingress resource will have the highest priority. If there is another resource that will be using the ingress resource host name, and it has a higher value than 1, then it means that this resource will be loaded in priority compared to the second one. We can take the redirection annotations from the previous resource and then just add them here because they'll be the same. Then finally we can complete the main body of our ingress resource by adding the host name. So for this resource, you'll notice we are using a complete host name and not a wildcard. And then it will be of type path prefix, and then it will be matching this service, and it will be sending traffic to this service on port 80, which is the port that the service exposes right here. Finally, we'll configure our game. This game will come from a public ECR repository. Let's start with the namespace where the game will be deployed. Here I'm using the namespace of apps -games. When we come back to our locals.tf, you can see we have a matching namespace. So this namespace will match any namespace that begins with apps -* or a wildcard. So here, this namespace is a match for this selector. And then for the profile, let's move on and add the deployment. Here now we have the deployment, which uses the namespace we just created, and then it has this name. Then we are passing in the app name and also the selector, which uses this label profile app games. Make sure the labels that you pass under match labels match the ones that you pass under metadata.labels right here. So this label, when you come back to locals.tf, you'll see that it also matches this one because it has this prefix in its name. So this container listens on port 80 and it pulls this public image for the 2048 game that you can play on your browser. We can add our service. So the service uses the same namespace and the same name as the deployment. It sends traffic to the container on port 80 and then it exposes port 80 on which it will receive traffic. Then the type will be not port, and then the selectors will be the same as the ones we are using here and also here. Finally, we'll add the ingress resource, and for our ingress resource, we can start with the first annotation and then we'll add the other annotations. You'll notice I'm using the same group name on the annotations, so we can just copy this first 3 and even including this one and also including the redirection from the demo, and then just come here and add those annotations here. We are using the same ingress group name for this particular annotation. So this is the same as Bloom, which is the same as the default backend, which means these 3 sets of resources will be sharing the same load balancer. Now we have our games ingress annotations ready. We need to specify the body. So just make sure you are using the correct domain here, the domain that we'll be using to create our ACM certificate, and also to add a CNAME record that will point to our applications. And that marks the end of preparing the demo applications. Now we can move to the next step,